These are my grandsons. Superheroes, every one of them carrying on the Richards family name with pride and distinction. You know, I suspect that this is a guy thing, but I suspect a lot of us as kids entertain these kinds of fantasies that we too would be those mild-mannered Clark Kents that were, unsuspected by the world around as to our true powers, our true abilities. But when the chips were down, when the world needed us most, suddenly we would emerge as that super figure to save the day. I was looking back at some history, and I think that maybe this whole idea of the Clark Kent and the phone booth and turning out to be Superman may have gone all the way back to King Charles XI of Sweden. King Charles was born in 1660, died in 1697, and what he was noted for was being a reformer. And he especially wanted to find corruption among his officials and root it out. And so the way that King Charles would do that is he would disguise himself. He would put on a gray cloak so that his kingly vestments would not be seen, and he would go riding out in the countryside into small towns and villages and get to know what was going on there. And if he came across something that he concluded was corrupt, an official acting badly, what he would do is confront the official, cast off the robe, and reveal that in fact he was the king, and deal with the ne'er-do-well. The passage we're going to be looking at today, I think that we see Jesus do something similar. Come into a setting in disguise, if you will, and then suddenly reveal himself for who he truly is. But before we get into that, we need a little backstory. We have been working through a series the last several weeks on the Gospel of John. And we have gotten up to John chapter 7, so let's go to verse 1, and here's what it says. After this, Jesus went about in Galilee. He would not go about in Judea because the Jews were seeking to kill him. Okay, a little backstory. The first backstory is, what does he mean after this? After what? Well, if you go back to John chapter 6, the most recent thing we've seen happen in John's account is the feeding of the 5,000. We talked about that last week. And also we have that account where the disciples get trapped in a storm on a boat, and Jesus isn't with them, and they think all is lost, and then Jesus comes to them walking on the water. However, neither of those events really stirred up too much debate. There wasn't much angst about either one of those miracles that Jesus did. I think the real after this goes back to John chapter 5. If you go back to John chapter 5, the story we looked at there was where Jesus came to a lame man at the pool of Bethesda and healed him. Guy had been there crippled for 38 years, I believe it was, and instantly is healed. And Jesus says, take up your bed and walk on out of here. And as you may recall, the real tension of that, the controversy surrounding it, was the religious authorities were upset, not that the guy was healed, but they were upset that he got healed on the Sabbath day because they considered an act of healing to be working on the Sabbath. And the fact that Jesus would work on the Sabbath to them was just completely offensive. What made it even worse was that when Jesus was challenged about this, the defense that Jesus gave for why he felt free to heal on the Sabbath made them even madder. He said, well, you all would agree that it's okay for God himself to work on the Sabbath. That had actually been a debate among them. Like, if you're supposed to rest, can God work? And they'd finally concluded that through some rather twisted logic, well, yeah, God could work on the Sabbath because if he wasn't working, everything would fall apart. So God was given kind of a special clause that he was allowed to do some work on the Sabbath. And Jesus says, well, God is my Father. And he takes on this apprentice language. An apprentice always work alongside and do what their father does. He says, God's allowed to work on the Sabbath. I am God's unique son, and that means it's okay for me to work on the Sabbath too. Well, that really ticked him off because they knew what he had just said. He had just equated himself with God, that he was entitled to the same special exemptions that God himself was entitled to. And so we find in John chapter 5 that this was why the Jews were seeking all the more to kill him. Because not only was he breaking the Sabbath, but he was even calling God his own Father, making himself equal with God. So right from the outset, we know that in Judea and specifically the city of Jerusalem, Jesus is persona non grata. He is not welcome. Actually, he's worse than not welcome. It's if he shows up, we want to find a way that we can kill him. John chapter 7, verse 2. Now the Jews' feast of booths was at hand. It's important to have a little backstory. So backstory number 2. Okay, backstory number 1, after this, has to do with the fact that the Jewish leaders are upset at Jesus about this healing on the Sabbath. Backstory number 2 has to do with this Jewish feast of booths, or sometimes called the Feast of Tents. It was one of the major feasts that the Jews celebrated, and everyone that could tried to come to Jerusalem for that feast. During this feast, people actually built small outdoor shelters that they lived in for the duration of the feast. And the symbolism of it was to remind them of their sojourn in the wilderness. The 40 years they spent living as nomads in tents in the wilderness, during this week they commemorated that by living in these little shelters. The feast culminated with a water festival. Each day of the festival, the high priest would lead a procession that would carry a golden pitcher filled with water to the temple. And when they got to the temple, the priest would pour that pitcher of water out on a rock. And the symbolism of it was to remind them of how God, in the wilderness, in a desert place where there was no water, had brought water for the people out of the rock. And they reminded themselves in that of God's provision, as well as the promise that God would continue to provide for them, and not just physically, but that God would spiritually provide for his people. As the priest did that, the people would chant from Isaiah chapter 12, verse 3. With joy you will draw water from the wells of salvation. So this chant is going up all around as the water is being poured out. And then the priest would read from Zechariah 14:8. On that day, living water shall flow out from Jerusalem, half of them to the eastern sea and half of them to the western sea. Zechariah looks ahead prophetically and says, a day is coming when the richness of God, the spiritual provision of God will flow out of Jerusalem as though Jerusalem were a massive watershed. You know, there's that point in the Rockies where depending on which side of the Rockies a raindrop falls determines if it will eventually make its way to the Atlantic or the Pacific Ocean. Zechariah pictures Jerusalem being that kind of watershed that God's life, God's power, God's blessing pours out on Jerusalem, and it flows east and west to cover the whole earth. So all of that was wrapped up in this celebration, a time of holy promise that someday God would provide. So tuck that little detail away because we're going to come back to it later. Verse 3. So his brothers, Jesus' brothers, said to him, leave here and go to Judea, that your disciples also may see the works you're doing. For no one works in secret if he seeks to be known openly. If you do these things, show yourself to the world. For not even his brothers believed in him. Now we first ran into Jesus' brothers back in John chapter 2, and it was right after he had performed his first sign of changing water into wine. We find out that after he had done that, he went down to Capernaum with his mother and his brothers and his disciples, and they stayed there for a few days. Now, we learn a little bit more about his brothers in Matthew chapter 13. Jesus, coming to his hometown, he taught them in their synagogue, so they were astonished and said, where did this man get this wisdom and these mighty works? Is not this the carpenter's son? Is not his mother called Mary? Are not his brothers, James and Joseph and Simon and Judas? And are not all his sisters with us? Where then did this man get all these things? So the hometown folks say, we know this guy. He's nothing special. Where does he come from thinking that he knows all this stuff and has all this power? We know his whole family. We find out here that Jesus had 4 brothers, half-brothers, obviously, and at least 3 sisters, because he says all of his sisters, not both of his sisters. Jesus being the oldest, and apparently with Joseph now deceased, because after Jesus is dedicated in the temple, we never hear about Joseph again. In fact, we see Jesus filling the role as the oldest son. Even as he hangs on the cross, he makes sure that someone, John, is appointed to care for his mother Mary. That was the responsibility of the oldest, to be sure the mother was taken care of. And so Jesus, being the oldest of the family, is the head of the family. But we find that being the top dog doesn't necessarily mean that everybody thinks that you're all that. John lets us know that at this point, Jesus' own brothers definitely are not convinced that he is all that. It says that not even his brothers believed in him. And so far as we know, Jesus had led a fairly unremarkable life up until he began his public ministry. But now all these things are happening, and his brothers come up with this idea. They're saying, go up to Judea, specifically up to Jerusalem, and show yourself. Show your stuff. Show them what you can do. Let them hear what you have to teach. There have been some that have thought that maybe his brothers were actually, in a underhanded way, trying to get Jesus killed. They're trying to push him into a dangerous situation that they know will lead to his demise. There isn't really any evidence, though, that they were hostile to him or that they were even aware, really, of the threat that Jesus was under from the authorities. I think the comment, no one works in secret if he seeks to be known openly, maybe is a bit of a dig. That maybe they saw Jesus as this small-town boy that has got a little bit of an overinflated opinion of himself. And yeah, he's done a few impressive things. They can't quite figure that out. But you know, if you really want to be a big shot, Jesus, what you need to do is get out of this small pond and go out there in the big pond up in Jerusalem. And it appears, since they don't believe in him, they're thinking, you're going to get cut down to size there. Once you get around some real theologians, once you get around some real power people, that's going to put you back in your place. I've heard it said that if you want to make it in music, you have to go to Nashville. But that when you get to Nashville, you better make sure that you can play guitar better than the guy that fills up your car at the gas station, and you can sing better than the gal that pours coffee at the coffee shop, because they both got there first. That's probably a bit of the idea in sending Jesus to Jerusalem. You think you are all that. Well, why don't you go where the really impressive people are, where there's lots of big rabbis and lots of educated people, and you see how you do in that setting. Jesus said to them, my time has not yet come, but your time is always here. The world cannot hate you, but it hates me because I testify about it that its works are evil. You go up to the feast. I'm not going up to this feast, for my time has not yet fully come. After saying this, he remained in Galilee. My time has not yet come, but your time is always here. We've talked before about Jesus' sense of timing. Jesus knew that he was on a trajectory that was going to culminate in crisis. It was going to culminate in the cross. But he also knew that the time for that crisis was not yet. We've seen Jesus say similar things. He said this to his mother when he changed the water to wine. My time has not yet come. And Jesus, I think, knows that his brothers have an agenda. They have the wrong agenda. They want him to put up or shut up. And then imagine if he had gone with them. Let's say he had gone along. What would they have done? Well, they would have pushed him into debates. They would have tried to create a scene. It would have brought on the crisis that Jesus says, it's not time for that yet. That's your agenda, not my Father's agenda. What does he mean by that phrase, your time is always here? I think all he's saying is, you guys don't have the meeting with destiny that I have. Any time is fine for you to go up, and the world doesn't hate you the way it hates me. And when he says the world, I believe he's talking about the Jewish religious world that they lived in. He says that world, you're still playing by the rules. You're still doing good stuff as far as they're concerned. You're not challenging the system, so you're not in any danger. But I'm challenging the system. I'm telling the system that it's become corrupt. And the world, that world, hates me because of it. Jesus knows that the tension is building. He says, my time has not fully come. He knows it's getting closer. That tension is increasing. The clock is ticking. But Jesus says, it's not quite time yet. You guys go. I'm going to stay for a bit. After his brothers had gone up to the feast, then he also went up, not publicly, but in private. The Jews were looking for him at the feast, saying, "Where is he?" Jesus does want to be in Jerusalem. And he already knows where and when he wants to show up, but he also knows that if he goes with his brothers, they're going to push him into situations where it's not time. He also knows the authorities are on the lookout for him. This is one of the things that John brings us back to time and again, that Jesus knew things that other people didn't think he should already know. But Jesus knows that there are people plotting for him and looking for him and just waiting for him to show up. And you can be sure if Jesus had walked in with his brothers, this whole entourage had walked in day one of the festival, they would have been seen. And they were going to arrest him as soon as they found him. And so Jesus waits and goes in his own time, on his own terms. It says that he went in private. What does that mean? Does it mean that he went up in disguise? Hat and glasses? I don't know. I think it probably means, for one thing, that he went without his disciples. We know that a large group of those that considered themselves his followers, you understand that there were different spheres of disciples, right? There were the multitudes, the crowds at large that thought Jesus was pretty cool. And then there was a smaller group that were disciples, but still a pretty big group that tended to follow Jesus and listen to him more and a little more devoted. And then there were the 12 that we're most familiar with. And within the 12, you have the three, Peter, James, and John, who were very close to Jesus. And then John himself, who appears to have been an especially close friend of Jesus. Among that bigger group, we didn't look at this last week, but in John chapter 6, Jesus said some things that were hard for them to swallow. He talked about the fact that those who would follow him would need to eat his flesh and drink his blood, which made no sense to any of them. It doesn't shock us too much because we've got the perspective from being on this side of the cross. We understand about celebrating communion and that symbolism, that metaphor of what Christ means in that. But to those people at that point, they didn't really get what he was talking about. And a lot of them found it very offensive. John chapter 6, verse 66 says, "After this, many of his disciples turned back and no longer walked with him." Now, the 12 didn't turn back. The 12 stayed with Jesus. But it's interesting, in this story, when Jesus goes up to Jerusalem, they're not mentioned. There's no mention about the 12 being with Jesus. And I suspect that when Jesus went up, he probably avoided going up with all of them for the same reason he didn't go with his brothers. They couldn't have helped themselves from blabbing. They're excited. They're excited being with Jesus. Great things have happened. You can be sure that Peter, at least, would have started name dropping with folks. Hey, I'm kind of in town here with, Jesus, the guy that killed the lame guy, that guy, I'm with him. So I think Jesus went up without these guys because he knew, again, they were going to push him into a situation that he did not want to be in. And there's also a lot of, Jesus, I think, slipped in with the crowds and avoided drawing a lot of attention. We don't see him setting up any big teaching venues. We don't see him doing any major signs and wonders along the way. He just blends into the crowd, middle of the week, and goes up to Jerusalem. That's a good thing because there was a lot of buzz going on about him. John chapter 7, verse 12. There was much muttering about him among the people. Well, some said, he's a good man. Others said, no, he's leading the people astray. Yet for fear of the Jews, no one spoke openly of him. Just a side note, one of the things this demonstrates is it doesn't matter who you are or what you do, you will always have some people that think you are wonderful and some people that think you are terrible. The Son of God, who was perfect, had people that thought he was a terrible individual. So just because some people don't like you doesn't mean you're necessarily doing the wrong thing. John reminds us, though, that there is this dark cloud that is hanging over all of these hushed debates that are going on. The people know that the Jewish leaders are looking for Jesus, that they're angry at him. And so even in their talks between themselves, they are worried about getting in trouble. About the middle of the feast, Jesus went up into the temple and began teaching. Okay, here's the question that at least crossed my mind. I hope it crosses yours, which is if there's so much tension, if these guys are looking for Jesus and they want to arrest him, how on earth does he end up in the temple teaching? That would seem to be kind of like the one place you wouldn't get to if they're all out to get you. Well, for one thing, we've already talked about the fact I don't think Jesus made a big splash when he came into town. There wasn't a big entourage around him. He was just one guy with a lot of other people filtering into the city. Our son, David, middle son, when he was a toddler, he was famous for escaping from nurseries. In fact, his most famous escape was we are at Mount Hermon Christian camp down Central California on the coast. Beautiful camp, big, very professionally run camp, full-time staff. And we had gone to a family camp there. And during some of the meetings, we had put David into their nursery. And of course, they have a professional nursery staff, wonderful children care area. And we had come out of a meeting, we're walking across the grounds, and there's hundreds of people milling around. And out of the crowds emerges our 3-year-old. And we're like, David, what are you doing here? Well, he wanted to come see Mommy and Daddy. We were pretty sure they hadn't just let him out. So we go back over to the child care area and brought our son back. And of course, you can imagine they are mortified. They're like, we have never lost a child. We are so sorry. And we're saying, it's okay. He does this to people all the time. It's not your fault. Now, how was it that David was so successful at escaping nurseries? Well, the way he did it was he just didn't make a fuss. David didn't get upset. He didn't get mad. He didn't cry. He didn't beg to go anywhere. When he decided he was done with the nursery, he just very quietly went over to the door, opened the door, let himself out, closed the door quietly, and walked away. And nobody knew he was gone. I kind of think that's what Jesus is doing here. He didn't make a big fuss. He just walked in with a whole lot of other people, went on up to the temple, middle of the week, and started teaching. If they were looking for Jesus, they would have been looking when everybody was arriving, day one. They would have been looking probably for his disciples, his brothers, and when they see these guys show up and Jesus isn't with them, well, they had other things they had to do. It's a busy time. Maybe they're looking for Jesus, but he wasn't the only thing on their agenda. And so they're busy with everything else, and there's lots of people in and out, and Jesus comes in among them. This also was in a day before there were photographs. You know, when you went to the post office, A, they didn't have a post office, and B, they didn't have pictures hanging up of the most wanted. Frankly, a lot of the Pharisees themselves had probably never actually seen Jesus. They had heard about him, they talked about him, but they didn't really have a face to go with the rumors. They were just looking for somebody that was going to be making issues, and they'd hone in on him, and they figured they'd find him. So everybody's in full swing, and suddenly a rabbi shows up in the temple midweek. Who's going to notice? And he sits down and begins to teach the folks that are right there, which again is nothing notable. The temple was kind of a rabbinical trade show during that time of year. There were lots of rabbis, and the temple was a huge area, thousands of people, and there'd be a rabbi over here and a rabbi over there, and this guy be expounding on some passage of the Old Testament, and this guy be expounding on something, and these guys would be debating, and people, as they're going through, are kind of stopping and listening to this guy and listening to that guy and watching that debate, and so for just another rabbi to sit down on his own and begin to teach was no big deal. Now, he did begin to draw a bit of a crowd because he was really a good teacher. I mean, he really knew his Bible. It was kind of like he'd written the thing. And they're impressed with that. The Jews therefore marveled, saying, "How is it that this man has learning when he has never studied?" These connoisseurs of religion are wandering around listening to teachers, and they're listening to this unknown rabbi, and what they're hearing is profound. But who they're hearing it from is puzzling to them. They say, well, this guy's not studied. He's not one of the elites that we know. He's not one of the names here in Jerusalem. We've learned earlier that these rabbis love to be known. You wanted to build your resume. You wanted to get your following. You wanted to have a lot of people tracking you on Twitter. I mean, this is what it was all about, to be at the pinnacle of your rabbinical career. You associated with the right people. But this guy obviously was not a Harvard man. We don't know him. Maybe his words gave him away. Maybe the fact that he had that country Galilean accent was the tip-off. Maybe it's the fact that he was saying profound things, but he wasn't using the language of the professional theologians. Every trade has its buzzwords. When I was selling medical equipment, one of the things you learn in the medical industry is that in hospitals, you don't have things that are urgent or immediate. What they are is they are emergent. Never heard that word anywhere else except in a hospital setting. But emergent, that's the buzzword. That's when you know you're in, when you can say that word. Well, among theologians, you have the in language that everybody knows. And maybe Jesus wasn't using the in language. When you read old commentators, it's funny because the old commentators, they just assume that everybody has their level of education. So they'll go along talking about some passage, and they'll say, well, it's like Euripides said, and then they'll start quoting Greek. And then to clarify it, they'll break into German. And in case you didn't get the German, they will then make a further comment in Latin and then go right back to English without any translation, because they just assume that you're going to know, Greek, German, and Latin if you're their level of education. Whatever it is, these people listening to Jesus are saying, how is it that he knows so much when he doesn't strike us as being one of the theological intelligentsia? So Jesus answered them. He says, my teaching is not mine, but his who sent me. If anyone's will is to do God's will, he will know whether the teaching is from God or whether I am speaking on my own authority. The one who speaks on his own authority seeks his own glory. But the one who seeks the glory of him who sent him is true, and in him there is no falsehood. Has not Moses given you the law? Yet none of you keeps the law. Why do you seek to kill me? Remember, I called the temple a rabbinical trade school. This was the place to make a name, to build a reputation. There was that temptation to seek self-glory in the guise of religion, in the guise of glorifying God, really trying to glorify myself. And Jesus knew that there was this corruption that was festering in the heart of Judaism. And Jesus says, I am not about promoting me. I'm about promoting my Father. This is not to build my name. This is to exalt God, who should be exalted. You remember King Charles XI? He loved to come in undercover, find corruption, and then throw off the cloak and reveal himself. Well, Jesus is getting ready, I think, to pull a King Charles here. Because right at the end of this, he throws in that last little phrase, why do you seek to kill me? Okay, that seems a little out of context, Jesus. I don't think anybody around here has said anything about killing you in this conversation. The crowd answered, you have a demon. Who's seeking to kill you? You're a madman. What are you saying? Jesus answered them, I did one work, and you all marvel at it. Moses gave you circumcision, not that it's from Moses, but from the fathers, and you circumcise a man on the Sabbath. If on the Sabbath a man receives circumcision, so that the law of Moses may not be broken, are you angry with me because on the Sabbath I made a man's whole body well? Do not judge by appearances, but judge with right judgment. Backstory number 1. Remember from John chapter 5, the lame man that Jesus healed? That man went away and told the Jews it was Jesus who had healed him. And this was why the Jews were persecuting Jesus, because he was doing these things on the Sabbath. And he said, my Father's working until now, and I am working. John chapter 7. Some of the people of Jerusalem therefore said, is not this the man whom they seek to kill? Suddenly they connect the dots. You're an impressive teacher. What do you mean people are trying to kill you? Well, folks, I healed one guy on the Sabbath, and everybody's upset. Wait a minute. You're the guy that healed the guy that everybody's going to talk. Oh, they're looking for you. This is the guy they want to kill, isn't it? For the sake of time, we're going to have to skip a little bit. But not surprisingly, the Pharisees, word gets back to them, and they send some of the temple guard to arrest Jesus. As we're going to see, that doesn't go as planned. because instead of arresting Jesus, the guards find themselves arrested by Jesus' message. Verse 37. On the last day of the feast, the great day, Jesus stood up and cried out, "If anyone thirsts, let him come to me and drink. Whoever believes in me, as the scripture has said, out of his heart will flow rivers of living water." Philip Comfort and Wendell Hawley, I love what they say about this. If any thirst, come. Those who are grimed with sin, those who are up and coming, and those who are down and out. Those who are persecutors and procrastinators, all are included in this grand invitation. Backstory number 2. Remember at the outset I asked you to log away this little stir in your memory about the fact that there was a water ceremony that was part of the Feast of Tabernacles? Do you see what's happening here? Part of this feast was commemorating the fact that in a wilderness desert place, God had brought water out of a rock. God had provided for his people. And now, in that context, Jesus says, if you're thirsty, come to me and drink. Whoever believes in me, not out of a rock will flow water, out of his heart will flow rivers of living water. And John goes on to tell us that what Jesus was talking about was that that person would be filled with God's Holy Spirit. You're celebrating just a drink of water that came from a physical rock, but Jesus is saying, I want you to know that I have come to do something far more profound. I have come to actually open your heart up and fill you with God's Spirit, that living water will flow out of you. Well, that leads to all kinds of confusion. There was a division among the people over him. Some of them wanted to arrest him, but no one laid hands on him. Some have real questions, some have nothing but cynicism. I love the response of the temple guards, the ones who were sent to arrest Jesus. The officers came to the chief priests and Pharisees, who said to them, "Why did you not bring him?" They send him out to make an arrest. They show up, no arrest. "Why did you not bring him?" And the officers answered, "No one ever spoke like this man." You know, the temple guards, these guys were not battle-hardened men. They were actually educated Levites themselves who had taken on this role of providing security in the temple. They had law enforcement duties, but their core concern, the thing that had brought them into the profession they were living in, was their desire for the glory of God. Jesus talked about a lot of the corruption that there was in the religious establishment, and there was a lot of it. But I think it's important to remember that not all of those who were involved in leadership were corrupt. There were many good people who loved God, who truly wanted to see his glory. And among these temple guards, I think we're hearing that. We're hearing some men who went thinking they were going after some kind of troublemaker and some kind of revolutionary, and as they began to listen to Jesus, their hearts are moved, and they're going, we've never heard anyone teach and say the things this man has taught. I love thinking about Acts chapter 6, verse 7. This comes after the day of Pentecost, after the cross, after the resurrection, after Pentecost, when Peter preaches his sermon. Here's what is recorded in Acts. The word of God continued to increase, and the number of the disciples multiplied greatly in Jerusalem, and a great many of the priests became obedient to the faith. There were good people there who truly did desire God's glory, and when they recognized who Jesus was, their hearts were ready to respond. You know, when you're in a desert place, when it's dry sand all around, what you long for is an oasis. You're looking for a place that has water, that can meet that most fundamental need of physical life, a cold drink. It's what they remembered when the priest poured the pitcher of water out on the rock, that God had provided for his people in a place where there was no water. He had provided for their need. And the promise that he would continue to provide for their need and provide abundantly for their need. There's two kinds of people. I find, that desire the oasis and may not experience it. The first are the oasis seekers. They're people who are out there in the desert, and life is dry. The things that their soul hungers for most, they seem to come up short. They're still thirsty. They're still looking for something, and they pursue things that turn out to be mirages. They think that this relationship or that accomplishment or this money or that possession or you name it is going to satisfy that thirst, but they find out that it never really takes care of the need. Those people keep looking for a real oasis, something that will truly fulfill what they long for at the deepest core of their being. There's also people that I would think of as oasis exiles. These are people who they found the oasis. They believe in the oasis. They know there's good water in the oasis, and yet they don't think that it's for them. Rather than finding a spring of water springing up within them, they carry a heart of stone because of past failures. A heart of stone that they've come to believe says, I'm not worthy to go into that oasis. That can't really be for me because of what I've done. Maybe it's something that goes way back to having been a teenager, a young adult in their 20s, maybe older, got involved in a relationship, somebody got pregnant, somebody decided that they just couldn't go through this pregnancy, and there was an abortion. And that young woman, and that young man have carried that stone with them, believing that this thing is something that God would never want in his oasis. God would never forgive me for that. Maybe it's the spouse that, at a point of dissatisfaction, found temptation and yielded. And there is that affair. Maybe an affair that no one's ever found out about. It was the weekend dalliance, but it's there. And you carry that stone in your heart, and you're convinced that God would not want me, truly, to experience the oasis. It's an addiction. It's a cheated business partner. It's a betrayed friend. It's a grudge that has been harbored for way too long. I've known people at one level will say, I believe in Jesus. I think that he is the way, but you see them carrying the stone because he wouldn't really want me in his oasis. And I just want to say to you that when Jesus made this declaration in the temple, he was surrounded by people that he knew their histories. When he met the woman at the well, he knew her history. She says, I don't have a husband. He says, well, yeah, that's true. You've had 5 husbands, and the guy you're living with now isn't your husband. I know all about you. But to all those people, with their sin, with their failure, with the rocks they were carrying, he says, I am the water. And if you will come to me, I want to break open that stone, and I want water to flow out of you. Because it is for you. It is for you. He is the oasis. If anyone thirsts, let him come to me and drink. Whoever believes in me, as the scripture has said, out of his heart will flow rivers of living water. To really believe is to drink it in for yourself. And if you're carrying a stone today, I just want you to know that Jesus would be delighted to break the stone. That's the reason he came. It's the reason he went to a cross. He took on the most severe penalty. The death penalty is for the most severe of crimes. He took on the most severe penalty to pay the price for the most severe sin. There is nothing that you carry that is bigger that he is willing to forgive and ready to break open in your life. So what does it look like when God pours his living water into a human heart? A couple weeks ago, I sat down with Jim Rockstad. Jim and his wife Mo are here. We videotaped a little interview, and I just want you to watch this. Well, so Jim, we just saw those dragsters going down the track. What on earth do those cars have to do with you?
Well, I understand that my whole life has been race cars and drag racing, and all the way up till I retired. And so, I know just about anything about them, and because I'm always with them.
So how many years did you spend in drag racing?
Well, I started out when I was in 8th grade, I think it was, and I left when I was, in 58 years.
50 years.
Yeah.
And you finished up the last part of your career. You were the general manager for was it Seattle International Raceways?
Yes, for sure. And that was 25 years of being at SIR, and it's actually 4 racetracks.
Well, I think any of us who've ever gone to the drag races, I know I took my sons to them, and it makes your chest thunder when those cars take off. What is it like to drive one of those cars to be?
Well, myself, I did race, and I used my Anglia, and it had a 450 cubic inch blown Chrysler motor inside of that, and it went 162 in the quarter mile. Of course, mine, you have to understand that there's an end to the deal because I rolled the thing over in Eugene, Oregon.
Wow.
That wasn't fun at all.
That wasn't fun at all. What are those cars like?
I can remember way back when I was real young, and it's kind of ho-hum and whatever, but these things are, it's 10,000 horsepower, and it's unreal.
For the top-end dragsters, what is a top speed for them in a quarter mile?
They're up to 333 miles an hour in 1,000
yards.
I'm sorry.
Okay, so 330 miles an hour and 1,000 yards.
Yes. They don't do a lot of the quarter mile anymore just because the cars go so fast and have to shut off. Sometimes they end up in the weeds at the other end.
So, I think to a lot of, maybe guys especially, we would think that here you are deep in the racing world, you're running these tracks, you're with these amazing cars, you're having a lot of success there. Life has to be pretty good at that point. And yet, I've read your story, we've talked a bit, and here you are at kind of the pinnacle of your career, and yet something was missing in your spiritual story.
Absolutely. This happened around in 70s, and what happened was I was under just incredible trying to do all this with 4 race car tracks, and I had a wife that went away and all that too, and it was just all of that mess, and I was out running and trying to coming up with an idea. What am I going to do? Where do I go? I'm just broken. I was a broken man at that point, and here was a small little church right there, and I just said, wow, I need this. And I just walked right over there, felt like I was pushed over there, which is wonderful. And we opened the door, and all these Christian folks were right, and they just pulled me right in. And of course, here's the actual original book.
This is the Bible you got.
Yeah. And here, if you go right, I'm sorry, right here, the back of here.
Go back a page.
Sorry. Yeah, there you go.
Oh, there we go. If you get in on that, right here at the bottom, August 14th, 1977.
Yes.
What happened on August 14th, 1977, Jim?
Well, obviously, right at that point, I accepted Christ, and I know that was a whole new life for me at that point. And I'm in the kind of a business that's, a little bit tough with the race cars and dealing with those. And I just knew that I needed to look more to Him. Christ was in my life, changing things daily. And I went to a little church in Kent, and it was hard to do because I couldn't leave the racetrack on a Sunday afternoon and go over there, but I always worked it out.
So what are some things that changed in your life once you met Jesus?
Well, everything. I mean, literally everything. I did. I just, all the things that I did and shouldn't have been doing, and and I just love the whole thing. I love the book, and I love Christ, and I just got a lot of people that are brand new that I never knew, Christian people, and here I am. Here they come, and we're getting together, and more so and more so and more so, and it was just wonderful.
Part of your story I enjoy is what I know happened when you finally retired, because you retired, but you didn't really retire. You got involved in an area of ministry. What did you get involved in as you retired out of racing?
Well, first of all, I started writing stories on racing because I had all that stuff spinning around in my head. And that was the first bit that went along for quite some time. And then what I wanted to do was put a book together, and I didn't know how to do it, but I knew that I wanted to, and the thing that I really wanted to do, because I know that these are going to people that are hot rodders and around the world.
Yeah.
And so I want to do my own, chapter of the thing done by me with everything but Christ and exactly why and what and who and why.
With your testimony in it.
Yes.
And then you got involved with Union Rescue Mission.
I did.
And why the Union Rescue Mission, and what did you do with them?
Well, it's kind of an interesting story because I was trying to come up with the promotion things because I did that forever, And I happened to see their they had an ad in a paper, and I thought, well, why don't I go see who they are? And I go over and shake hands and say, do you have any, material here that I could get from you and just kind of see if there's something I could do? And I went home, and my wife and we made some letters up, and we aimed it at, the Thanksgiving. And I went to them and shook hands and said, we want to do things. And then we just started hooking up with money from around our home. And then that got bigger and bigger and then went all the way for 15 years.
Wow. Well, I think what a great example of taking a lifetime being a promoter for races and taking that set of skills and turning that into, for your retirement, promoting a cause for the gospel, helping with the Union Rescue Mission. And it's a great story.
It is a great story.
Great story of what God's done in your life, both all those years of racing and bringing you to himself and in the years since then. So thank you very much for sharing it.
I appreciate that. And I thank you. And I really like the church here. And it's just a wonderful place. And I just thank you for that too.
So any of you guys that want to talk cars, hit Jim up afterwards. Did you hear what Jim said? What changed? Everything. I don't know if you can relate to Jim's story about being at a place where you feel broken, overwhelmed, crushed by what's coming in. But if you've walked in here and you're saying, is there anything deeper? Jesus would say, yes. I would love to pour my water into your life and let it flow out of you to others. Amen?